The assault on my front door commenced at 9:47 on a Tuesday evening. I recall the precise moment because the microwave's illuminated digits were the first thing I registered when his knuckles met the wooden frame. "Open this bloody door. You've destroyed me, destroyed us." Andrew's voice fractured on those final syllables, transformed into something I scarcely recognized from the man I'd committed my life to nearly 2 decades prior. Nothing resembled the composed, self-assured individual who'd pledged his vows all those years ago. I remained motionless in my own hallway, spine pressed firmly against the cool wall, my arms wrapped around my torso. I made no movement toward that door, not a single step forward. 72 hours earlier, I still harbored hope that my marriage possessed something worth salvaging. My name is Megan Brooks. I'm currently 42 years old, employed as a medical records administrator for a substantial hospital network operating throughout Nashville, Tennessee. My profession had long ago taught me a fundamental lesson: paperwork remains truthful even when individuals decidedly do not. Over 19 years, I'd been bound to Andrew, a man who'd constructed a flourishing renovation enterprise from little more than a vehicle and some basic tools. Throughout the majority of our time together, I'd felt genuine pride in him, in what we'd built jointly. I genuinely believed we represented the sort of partnership that demonstrated commitment, the kind of people who understood that matrimony demanded shouldering life's burdens as a unified force. I discovered precisely how mistaken I was on a Saturday morning, inside a hospital corridor that reeked of disinfectant and burnt coffee residue, observing my mother's complexion shift from its natural tone to an alarming shade of ashen. Helen Carter, presently 68 years old, had single-handedly raised both my sister Rachel and myself following my father's passing. She'd worked consecutive shifts at a diner for years on end before finally achieving retirement with nothing more than a modest pension and her unshakable sense of dignity. She has genuinely never requested anything from me. Therefore, when she phoned that morning, her voice sounding thin and uncharacteristically strained as she described difficulty breathing, I abandoned everything and raced toward her residence with such urgency that I nearly misjudged the turn onto her street. By the time the paramedics had successfully stabilized her condition, and the cardiologist had extracted me into a private space, clipboard in hand, and utilizing that characteristically measured physician's tone, I already sensed the situation's gravity. "A valve replacement," he explained. "Medically urgent, not emergent precisely, but sufficiently time-sensitive that postponement becomes genuinely inadvisable." Then followed the figure that fundamentally altered everything: $6,200 required before they would schedule the surgical intervention. Deductible combined with coinsurance charges. That's how contemporary healthcare functions when someone has subsisted their entire existence on the financial precipice. I simply didn't possess these funds readily accessible in any account. Not without liquidating assets I absolutely could not compromise. Yet Andrew and I did possess them collectively, or so I believed we did. We'd recently completed our purchase of a property situated near Old Hickory Lake, a familial investment, as Andrew had phrased it during dinner conversation, his chest figuratively expanding with satisfaction as he discussed this acquisition. Recalling that moment in that hospital hallway, clutching my mother's clinical documentation, I genuinely comprehended what matrimony was supposed to accomplish. You accumulated resources together precisely so that when circumstances became destabilized, you possessed something concrete to depend upon. Thus, I telephoned him. He responded on the third ring, and I could distinguish a television program in the background, some competitor-based game show with its characteristic buzzer sounding. I communicated the information about my mother, regarding her necessary cardiac surgery, regarding the specific monetary requirement. I maintained my equilibrium because that represents who I am fundamentally. I remain composed. I identify and resolve complications. I do not experience emotional collapses within medical facility corridors. I posed the question, could we access our savings temporarily until I could arrange a more permanent resolution? A protracted silence followed, an extremely protracted one. "We just acquired that Lakehouse," he finally responded, as though I'd somehow forgotten this transaction, as though my concern was unreasonable in comparison to his recent acquisition. Manage it yourself, Megan. I actually emitted a single, disbelieving laugh, because certainly I'd misunderstood him. Undoubtedly, my spouse of 19 years had not. Simply instructed me to independently arrange my terminally ill mother's cardiac intervention merely 72 hours, subsequent to finalizing documentation on a leisure property. Before I could formulate a response, I heard fabric shifting, the telephone changing hands, and subsequently Carol's unmistakable voice, my mother-in-law's tone sharp as a culinary implement despite her apparent attempt at reasonableness. "Discontinue calling my son," she pronounced. "Contact your own relations regarding this matter." The connection terminated immediately. I remained there, clutching my mobile device, whilst the hospital's fluorescent illumination hummed relentlessly overhead. My mother existed somewhere behind those double doors, awaiting confirmation regarding whether she'd proceed with her scheduled surgery or whether we'd be compelled to postpone it, gambling with her cardiac function, because the necessary finances simply weren't forthcoming. I examined my phone's display, observing the call registry indicating Andrew, 3 minutes 47 seconds, and experienced something within my thoracic cavity become profoundly quiet and profoundly arctic. 19 years, 2 children we'd nurtured and launched into their respective existences, anniversary celebrations, those midnight moments when his enterprise nearly collapsed and I accepted supplementary employment to sustain us both. Consistently, I'd reinforced to myself that authentic affection meant manifestation even during inconvenient circumstances. Within 3 minutes and 47 seconds, everything that had constituted my marriage distilled itself into a solitary declaration: manage it yourself. I refrained from weeping. I must clarify this truthfully because individuals typically anticipate my describing a breakdown within that hospital corridor, yet I didn't experience one. What I felt transcended grief. It resembled comprehension, a metaphorical barrier closing somewhere profoundly within me, soundless and terminal, the particular acoustic sensation you solely perceive within subsequent silence. I creased the insurance documentation until the folds achieved sharp, incisive edges, then walked back toward the waiting room where my sister Rachel remained, still wearing her outerwear. For the first time throughout my matrimonial partnership, I permitted myself to conceptualize the complete thought through to its conclusion. Perhaps I genuinely never constituted his priority whatsoever. Standing within that hallway, I remained unaware that the conversation I just experienced represented merely a preliminary introduction to what awaited me. I genuinely didn't comprehend that within 72 hours, that identical individual would be pummeled my residential door, screaming allegations that I'd obliterated him. I hadn't yet learned concerning his concealed activities. I possessed no knowledge of the envelope awaiting my discovery, or the written correspondence contained within it, or the forewords that would ultimately restructure my entire existence's trajectory. Solely one certainty remained as I stood in that corridor with my mother's surgical status still unresolved. I required $6,200, and my spouse had merely communicated that I faced this obstacle independently. My mother's surgical procedure was appointed for 6:00 the subsequent morning, which signified that somehow, through some means, the financial resources required needed materialization by day's conclusion. I invested the afternoon performing mathematical calculations, ones I genuinely hoped never to execute again. My personal checking account. My sister Rachel's modest educator's compensation. A credit card possessing a maximum that wouldn't cover even a fraction of the requirement. Rachel extended everything she possessed without hesitation, and I experienced tremendous affection for her in that moment. However, despite our combined efforts, we remained substantially short of the necessary amount, by an acknowledgement neither of us wished to voice aloud. Around 7:00 that evening, I occupied a plastic chair within the surgical preparation area, staring blankly into nothing, when I observed a recognizable silhouette progressing along the corridor direction toward my location. William Brooks. My father-in-law traversed at a deliberately measured pace these days compared to his earlier mobility. Yet something intentional characterized his movements this particular evening, the comportment of someone who'd reached a determination and refused to permit self-doubt to interfere. William, now 72, represents a retired accounting practitioner, the variety of individual who dedicated 4 decades to guaranteeing others' financial documentation remained truthful, somehow producing a son incapable of maintaining his own ethical standards. He and I had perpetually shared a quiet, understated rapport. He participated minimally throughout family gatherings, merely observing the manner accountants typically do, carefully cataloging particulars others overlooked. He positioned himself beside me without utterance, subsequently pressing an envelope into my possession. It registered heavier than I'd anticipated. Refrain from examining it here, he communicated quietly. Wait until solitude. I requested clarification, yet he merely shook his head, patted my hand single time with gentleness, and instructed me to prioritize my mother's well-being. Subsequently, he stood and retreated down that identical corridor, and I remember experiencing the conviction that he resembled someone transferring something burdensome he'd maintained for considerably extended duration. I demonstrated less restraint than he'd requested. I proceeded toward the family facilities down the passage, secured the entrance, and unsealed the envelope with hands that trembled with irregular rhythm. Within resided a bank draft for precisely $6,200, the exact amount the medical establishment required, and positioned underneath it, a solitary sheet of stationery inscribed in William's meticulous, antiquated penmanship. Andrew has deceived you for extended duration. Withhold confidence regarding anything concerning that Lakehouse. I should have communicated this considerably earlier. I'm genuinely regretful. I examined it thrice. Every successive reading rendered the words simultaneously less comprehensible and increasingly significant. Less because I couldn't yet decipher their complete implications, more because some intuitive part of my consciousness comprehended they represented something monumental. I transported the bank draft to admissions prior to the deadline approaching. My mother underwent surgical intervention the subsequent morning precisely according to schedule, and I maintained vigil within that identical waiting area for 4 hours that seemed equivalent to 40, observing the illuminated status display transform from procedure commencing to closure to finally recovery bay. When the surgeon emerged, continuing to wear his operating apparel, and communicated that the valve reconstruction had executed flawlessly, I positioned my face within my hands and permitted myself authentic weeping, not from anxiety anymore, but from respite so acute it produced physical sensation. William occupied a nearby chair that afternoon when I emerged from visiting my mother, now resting within recovery. He articulated nothing initially. He simply extended a paper beverage container containing vending machine refreshment and permitted me to experience the moment. Thank you, I ultimately conveyed, referring to his monetary gift. I genuinely don't comprehend how I can. Expressing gratitude isn't required, he interrupted with gentleness. However, you must attend closely to what I'm about to communicate. He explained, employing that same deliberate tone he'd presumably once utilized while communicating complicated taxation concepts to apprehensive clientele, that the Lakehouse wasn't what I'd accepted it to be. I communicated my incomprehension. We'd closed the transaction collaboratively. I'd authorized documentation. I'd observed the property listing itself. Did you personally examine the deed? He questioned. I hadn't. I'd observed documentation Andrew had positioned before me one evening, whilst I felt distracted and exhausted following an extended shift. I'd affixed my signature where he'd indicated, because matrimonial partnership had conditioned me toward reliance upon his representations, toward utilizing shortcuts and abbreviated exchanges that never seemed to culminate in complete clarification. William's jaw contracted. He resembled someone carrying something sufficiently heavy that it had commenced deforming his posture. He never harbored intentions for you to possess it, he conveyed quietly. I experienced the identical Arctic clarity from 72 hours prior settling back into my thoracic cavity. I contemplated the telephone exchange. We just acquired that Lakehouse. I contemplated Carol seizing the phone. I contemplated the effortlessness with which she'd communicated that I should contact my own relatives, implying that his relatives and mine had never constituted a solitary family whatsoever. I directed my focus toward William, and articulated the solitary inquiry that genuinely mattered. What else am I unaware of? He didn't formulate a prompt response. He merely surveyed his hands folded within his lap, an elderly person's hands, steady from multitudinous years of financial columns and figures and other individual secrets. Substantially more than you contemplate, he ultimately replied. However, you'll require substantiation before you'll credibly accept it, and similarly will everyone else. I did not achieve sleep that evening. I remained positioned beside my mother's hospital bed, experiencing the monitoring apparatus's steady beeping indicating her cardiac function persisting. Remaining her own. I contemplated my cardiac function, pondering the duration it had subsisted in supplementary exertion, maintaining belief in something that potentially never truly represented reality for any significant duration. My mother departed the medical facility 72 hours, subsequently, progressing deliberately, yet breathing substantially more comfortably compared to she had in preceding months. Following confirmation of her stability, following Rachel's establishment within the residential guest quarters to facilitate her recuperation, I ultimately granted myself permission to examine the question that had remained circling my consciousness since William had presented that envelope. What precisely didn't I comprehend? Rachel discovered me Thursday evening at my dining table, my laptop displaying the information, 3 separate financial account documents reproduced and distributed across the surface, resembling investigative evidence, because genuinely, that represented their nature. She positioned herself beside me without solicitation and examined my shoulder. What documentation are we examining? She inquired. Our accumulated savings, I responded, or what persists of it. The statistic displaying before me produced physical sensation comparable to dissolution, an account that ought to have carried near to $40,000, funds we'd accumulated throughout more than a decade through meticulous fiscal discipline, now displayed just under $3,000. I scrolled through previous transaction registries, and there materialized the evidence. Transfers I'd never authorized, amounts that aligned with nothing I could recall acquiring, everything directed toward account identification I'd never witnessed previously. Rachel's communication emerged quiet yet resolute. Megan, you require legal representation immediately if obtainable tonight. I experienced inclination toward objecting, some persisting impulse still seeking clarification that wouldn't necessitate acknowledging duplicity, business expenditure, fiscal matters, something Andrew would rationalize away with characteristic persuasiveness, and his half-grin that historically enabled me to convince myself everything remained manageable. Yet the financial information remained unambiguous, and William's written communication maintained echoing throughout my cognition. He never harbored intentions for you to possess it. Andrew currently resided with his relatives that particular week, providing us mutual distance subsequent to the telephone exchange, or that's what he'd asserted. The circumstance afforded me residential occupation alone, and additionally provided me, for the inaugural occasion throughout 19 years, the conviction to enter his personal office and genuinely examine. I require candor. I'd never previously gone through his possessions, not because I harbored apprehension regarding potential discoveries, but because I possessed no motivation to examine. That represents what reliance accomplishes. It seals entrances so delicately you forget their existence. His desktop drawer remained unsealed. It wasn't even thoroughly sealed, merely fractionally ajar, resembling he'd departed hurriedly and never came back to arrange it. Within, I discovered a manila folder, substantial, densely populated with documentation. Financial institution loan documents, title records, mortgage paperwork displaying the Lakehouse address, inscribed across the top in sturdy ebony typography. I positioned myself upon the flooring beside his workspace and proceeded methodically through every documentation. The loan submissions cited our joint household earnings, which signified it cited my revenue, my professional designation, my employment background. Everything entered into methodical boxes that had persuaded the financial institution to greenlight authorization for a $210,000 water-adjacent property acquisition. He'd leveraged my professional background to certify. That component didn't genuinely astonish me. Coupled spouses accomplish this routinely, and technically nothing proved problematic with it in isolation. What suspended my respiration? The deed itself, positioned underneath the borrowed funds documentation, the ink still crisp, appearing barely examined. Exclusive proprietor Andrew Brooks. My identity appeared nowhere, not as a mutual owner, not as a designee, not even as supplementary documentation. I examined the completion date. The identical week we'd ostensibly finalized the acquisition jointly, the identical week I remembered affixing my signature at my dining table, fatigued, distracted, confiding. I examined the signature documentation. Positioned at the conclusion was my identification, Megan L. Brooks, inscribed in penmanship that resembled my own nearly identically. The matching gentle slant on my initial. The comparable curvature I execute within my surname. I surveyed it deliberately, employing the analytical methodology IDA-Q. Ired through examining files at my workplace, educated to identify discrepancies in patient documentation. The stress distribution was erroneous. My signature initiates delicate and intensifies progressively, an inclination emerging from extensive rapid documentation. This inscription remained uniform throughout, deliberate, meticulous, the signature of someone replicating me instead of representing me. I remained positioned on that workplace flooring extensively, the documentation resting upon my lap seeming progressively heavier. Something transitioned irreversibly internally. It wasn't bewilderment anymore. Bewilderment had preceded it, manifested throughout the exchange, manifested through the envelope, manifested via the depleted account. This sensation was substantially more frigid and considerably more resolved. The perception of observing the concluding puzzle component accomplish position within an illustration I desperately wanted to see differently, yet couldn't abandon anymore. Someone had inscribed my identification upon a legal documentation. Someone had leveraged my compensation to guarantee a monetary obligation I was never meant to advantage from. Someone had manufactured an entire property, an entire deception, upon the foundation of my reliance, subsequently communicated I needed to autonomously arrange my mother's critical surgical procedure because he'd invested our capital into a lakeside residence that contained nothing affiliated with me whatsoever. I reproduced every documentation, photographically utilizing my mobile device prior to positioning the folder back precisely where I'd discovered it. The edges coordinating perfectly, the drawer remaining fractionally ajar identically. I didn't desire him comprehending I'd observed it currently, not till I understood precisely what I was handling. That evening, I contacted Laura Bennett. A matrimonial and fiscal deception attorney, a workplace colleague had recommended extended duration prior for entirely alternative reasoning. I transmitted a communication requesting her most available appointment moment. Subsequently, I positioned myself within my unlit residential quarters, mobile in possession, and examined one additional occasion, the photographic representation of that signature, my identification in someone else's meticulous handwriting, and I comprehended that whatever was transpiring regarding my partnership had transformed beyond merely a lakeside property or a solitary communication. It centered upon duration. Upon comprehending precisely how extended I'd been receiving falsehoods and the quantity of additional information I remained unaware of. William phoned me 72 hours afterward, early Saturday morning, his communication conveying intensity I'd never before detected from him. He questioned whether I could go to his property while Carol attended her recurring bridge gaming assembly. I confirmed availability within 20 moments, and I maintained my commitment. He accepted me via the secondary entrance instead of the primary threshold, communicating through his action prior to utterance that whatever this represented, he wanted Carol arriving unexpected to discover it. He conducted me throughout his cooking area and outdoors toward the storage structure where a solitary uncovered illumination suspended from the ceiling and orderly storage containers organized the far wall, each labeled within his meticulous accountant's penmanship. Taxation Documentation 2015. Equipment Warranties. William Personal Medical. He extracted one container from an elevated position, one displaying no inscription, and positioned it upon the functioning surface separating us. Andrew requested I maintain this several years previously, he communicated. He communicated it was just extra workplace documentation, nothing significant. I possessed no motivation to examine it until currently. Within were file containers precisely organized despite Andrew's assertion that this represented simple disorganization. Taxation documentation, spanning nearly a complete decade, home loan documentation, operational records from his renovation organization, and a substantial collection of reproduced email exchanges. William had plainly previously examined some. Multiple documents contained adhesive notes alongside the edges, his handwriting recording particular dates and individuals. I initiated with the email communications because something within William's averted attention communicated to me that represented the genuine substance within this receptacle. The majority appeared ordinary, standard correspondence with his fiscal consultant, an individual identified as Greg Peisel, addressing commercial investments and quarterly monetary data. Yet one email message originating from nearly 3 years preceding triggered my hands to become motionless upon the documentation. Once Helen passes, Megan inherits her property. We restructure via refinancing and incorporate it into the Lakeside acquisition. Should provide adequate equity to increase commercial operations without compromising present capital reserves. I examined it repeatedly, necessitating the redundancy to guarantee I wasn't manufacturing alternative terminology, morphing them into something far less reprehensible than their authentic substance. My spouse had put in writing to his fiscal consultant, articulated around my mother's mortality, not her well-being in philosophical terminology, not her future passing, as we all accept our elder relations will someday leave this existence, but a particular, calculated proposition timed to her decease. Constructed to extract monetary value from a property she'd invested her complete lifespan acquiring. He's maintained this for extended duration, William articulated quietly, observing my expression. I discovered this folder 18 months prior. I ought to have communicated this at that moment. For what reason didn't you? I requested, declining to soften the penetration within my communication. William positioned himself upon an antiquated equipment stool adjacent the functional table, appearing progressively aged than I'd experienced him appearing progressively aged than his stated 72 years. Because he represents my offspring, he articulated. And I maintained, reassuring myself he'd progress, that this represented something impermanent, that fiscal strain was affecting his judgment, that following circumstances stabilized, he'd revert to the person I'd educated him to become. He shook his head gradually. I perpetually erred, and every moment I didn't communicate with you I was preferring him over you. I'm terminating that action currently. I lacked the capability to experience animosity toward William. Every sentiment he was managing, he'd transported into that construction space and ultimately positioned before me, representing something Andrew had never accomplished throughout 3 times of quietness since the communication exchange. I examined the box's residual materials slowly, systematically, identically to my approach examining patient documentation when calculations weren't aligning, searching for the discussion threading everything collectively. Additional transfers materialized, ones I comprehended currently, that equivalent unfamiliar account designations from my personal statements, everything channeling toward what appeared to be a different commercial establishment Andrew had organized without my participation, one that didn't appear throughout our aggregate taxation documentation. Annotation regarding the waterside structure's projected resale valuation, computations for leverage, he projected to obtain following mortgage restructuring underneath conditions that would mysteriously distance me much further from any legitimate entitlement to it. The most incriminating material was manuscript commentary inserted within the folder's posterior in Andrew's characteristic penmanship. The variety of unguarded annotation someone composes for no individual except themselves. Megan remains unquestioning if I maintain the sums sufficiently modest. She believes my explanation. I've investigated her behavioral patterns precisely. I remained examining that communication significantly. 19 years diminished to an evaluation, a behavioral investigation he'd accomplished with meticulous attention, the equivalent analytical precision he'd utilize examining a renovation, prospect's economic circumstances, recognizing the simplest access via which to advance. William witnessed me cautiously reposition the communication back within the folder. I recognize regret doesn't eliminate any of this, he communicated. However, my remorse surpasses my capability to communicate. I regarded this person who'd produced the individual I'd wedded, who'd committed his professional tenure guaranteeing financial information remained sincere, and who had ultimately, however tardy, concluded that truthfulness mattered significantly more than safeguarding his offspring. I repositioned my fingertips upon his. You transmitted the capital for my mother's surgical procedure, I articulated. You didn't require accomplishing that, and you didn't require presenting me any of this documentation currently. I comprehend the sacrifice this necessitates. He nodded, his communication faltering. For a moment, we remained positioned jointly in that inadequately illuminated construction space, with my matrimonial deterioration arrayed upon the functional table amongst us. Throughout my departure, I photographed the container's substances and maintained additional reproduction duplicates within my communication device. Navigating residence, while comprehensive documentation photographed and protected in triplicate, I experienced something solidify internally that had maintained delicate and hopeful continuously. This represented no miscommunication. Th. Is wasn't an unfavorable month, or a pressured individual expressing careless commentaries throughout a demanding afternoon. This embodied a proposition carefully manufactured throughout extended periods, expecting composedly for my mother to experience decease, so my spouse could advantage from her non-existence. I positioned my transport within my driveway, deactivated the apparatus, and positioned myself within the stillness for an extended duration prior to ultimately expressing the communication loudly to exclusively myself, experiencing what the expressions communicated within my individual acoustic pattern. I'm pursuing dissolution of this partnership. They sensed, for the inaugural moment spanning 3 times, corresponding to complete truthfulness I'd expressed. They sensed like returning residents subsequent to prolonged wandering. Laura Bennett's workplace positioned itself throughout the 3rd level of a transformed brickwork composition, the variety of location displaying erosion throughout hardwood and academically recognized credentials, arranged efficiently beside wall surfaces. Following my positioning within her office throughout her desk, I comprehended instantly for which reason my workplace collaborator had advocated her so decisively. She accepted my complete narrative without momentary pause, her pen moving regularly throughout a legitimate documentation tablet. Following, I lastly repositioned my communication device across the table, displaying the photographic evidence of the documentation, the correspondence, and Andrew's handwritten commentary. She processed everything within quiet prior to examining upward. This necessitates considerable moment to construct accurately, she articulated. However, Megan, what you've presented me represents adequately to commence. Throughout the following 14 times, Laura's workplace became something comparable to employment for me. I encountered her multiple instances weekly, every interaction peeling successive levels regarding what Andrew had manufactured. She recruited a forensic monetary professional, a calm female designated Denise, who specialized in precisely this variety of fiscal disintegration. Collaboratively, they manufactured a succession chronicling my digestive tract deterioration consistently. The forged signature attained confirmation within the inaugural period. An individual specializing in penmanship, Laura subcontracted compared my verified signature throughout the mortgage documentation and recognized what she designated as inconsistencies sufficiently substantial to recommend additional examination. Professional terminology for what I'd previously comprehended intrinsically. Someone had inscribed my identification, and considering accessibility regarding my signature methodology and motivation, the principal applicant was positioned in his relative's household. Denise followed the monetary transferences from my collective funds toward a commercial account Andrew had organized 18 months prior, using a marginally altered identification compared to his renovation organization. Brooks Excellent Holdings, a conceptual entity, consistent with their assessment, existing exclusively for moving monetary resources somewhere I'd neglect to examine. Nearly $31,000 had transferred via that account. Throughout merely the concluding period, some directed into the waterside property's monetary contribution, some just expended, invested in matters Denise continued attempting to recognize. Laura submitted documentation requesting short-term freezing of our collective accounts and preliminary prohibition preventing liquidation or restructuring involving the waterside residents. Though the assessment continued, she cautioned me it could motivate him. She wasn't mistaken. Andrew phoned that comparable afternoon, subsequently an hour subsequently 6 instances prior to evening meal. I dismissed all. Throughout that inaugural period, my communication log indicated beyond 40 non-answered communications, supplemented by dispersed message transmissions that changed radically separating resentment and something mimicking supplication. We require communication. You're experiencing irrationality. My grandfather's accountable, not myself. Respond to me, Megan. I genuinely signify this. I examined every communication and disregarded all of them. Laura had transmitted unambiguous direction throughout the commencement. Something I articulated throughout anger or uncertainty could face usage contrary to me subsequently, being misinterpreted into something alternative. Therefore, I permitted my telephone to vibrate throughout my kitchen surface, and I concentrated rather upon my mother, who recovered well, positioned in her armchair throughout majority afternoons, sufficiently resilient currently to inquire pointed queries regarding my apparently distracted condition. I hadn't communicated the comprehensive narrative yet. I transmitted what I could articulate, that Andrew and I were experiencing genuine complications, that separation appeared probable, that I required her concentrating upon recovery while I managed the residual component. She analyzed my appearance through the characteristic maternal methodology, perceiving straight through the censored information. Yet she declined to require elucidation. She merely situated her digits upon my hand and articulated, "You've consistently comprehended managing matters, Megan. I believe in you." The situation's changing moment originated from an individual I hadn't anticipated leaning upon so significantly, William. He participated voluntarily with Laura's workplace without my solicitation and occupied his time across from her nearly 120 moments, directing her throughout everything he comprehended. The container from his construction space, the correspondence separating Andrew and his fiscal consultant, the multitudinous occasions he'd harbored misgivings regarding something wrongful, yet maintained silence. He documented a legitimate affidavit confirming everything he'd found, and the temporal sequence, supplemented by his recollection of presenting me the envelope throughout that hospital afternoon. Laura communicated afterward that William's cooperation embodied, per her articulation, the most substantial leverage element we maintained. A biological father delivering testimony contrary to his offspring didn't constitute something juries or magistrates considered lightly. It represented something substantially deeper than any monetary documentation might convey, something indicating this circumstance extended beyond a disappointed spouse exaggerating complaints. This constituted a circumstance sufficiently problematic that even Andrew's familial unit couldn't protect it. Carol exhibited the projected fury discovering William's participation. I gained knowledge through William himself, who phoned one evening seeming both emotionally depleted and peculiarly reduced in psychological weight. She attributed me with deceiving his offspring, she articulated. He reciprocated that throughout 30 temporal units he'd guaranteed individuals that monetary information omits falsity, and he remained unwilling terminating that exercise, not even supporting Andrew. I questioned regarding his personal condition, authentic concern despite everything. He stayed quiet momentarily, previously responding. "Superior compared to I anticipated," he articulated. "I hypothesize I've been managing this extended compared to I comprehended." It demonstrates something peculiar the way authenticity feels, irrespective of its repulsiveness, he articulated. I comprehended precisely what he intended. Every moment that progressed with the situation developing, with confirmation collecting within methodically designated containers throughout Laura's workplace, I experienced less comparable to a person experiencing shattering and progressively comparable to someone methodically establishing authentic foundation. Yet quietude, I was discovering progressively, contains the capability to agitate those profiting from disturbance. Andrew's communications persisted. Should anything, they intensified. A particular evening, progressing via the communication collection on my communication device, I discovered something transitioning. Not aggravation anymore, not entreaty, something substantially colder and progressively manipulative. You lack comprehension regarding what you're about to execute toward yourself, Megan. Communicate with me previously, this progresses considerably further. I implore you. I transmitted it instantaneously to Laura exactly how she directed. She phoned me within the hour. He comprehends we're approaching submission, she articulated. Which signifies he comprehends his biological father engaged. Megan, I necessitate your preparedness. Individuals resembling this don't accommodate forfeiting authority effectively. I guaranteed her I'd maintain alertness. I didn't at that moment comprehend how precisely accurate her alert proved. The preliminary tribunal seemed executed Thursday morning in a courtroom smaller compared to I anticipated. Everything remained beige composition and fluorescent illumination, negligible correlation to the sensationalized depictions I'd experienced cinematically. Laura positioned herself beside me through the claimant's position, continuously relaxed in a methodology that stabilized my personal tension. Whereas positioned across the judicial area, Andrew sat with his personal legal representative, declining to regard my position even momentarily. I hadn't witnessed him physically throughout the preceding trio of periods. He resembled dramatically diminished, his facial structure rigid, someone demonstrably disintegrating beneath strain he'd neglected to expect confronting. A component of my existence, some diminutive, obstinate fraction I hadn't completely abandoned, experienced aching regarding his appearance. 19 periods doesn't disappear exclusively because reality ultimately manifests. Yet that ache positioned itself quietly beside something significantly more commanding, resolution, and something comparable to steadiness. Laura commenced by presenting the fiscal investigation professional's thorough documentation, conducting the magistrate throughout the monetary transferences into Brooks' excellent holdings, the interim business Andrew leveraged for redirecting finances beyond our collective savings throughout practically a couple of periods. Denise testified and communicated in unambiguous, proportionate terminology, precisely the mechanics of monetary movement, the situation where resources culminated, and correspondence regarding resource transference, corresponding specifically with substantial expenditure regarding the waterside residents. Subsequently came the individual concentrating on handwriting confirmation, who communicated that the signature throughout the financial documentation demonstrated measurable inconsistencies with my recognized signature, inconsistencies adequate in her specialized judgment to recommend probability regarding falsification. Andrew's judicial consultant challenged, proposing ordinary signature modification happening progressively, yet the investigator persisted, directing the magistrate throughout compression points and communication methodology with the determination of someone who'd executed this repeatedly. The communication represented the instantaneous when I experienced the judicial area transferring. Laura articulated it aloud, deliberate and restrained, permitting every terminology to effect. Once Helen passes, Megan acquires the property. We restructure via refinancing and incorporate it into the waterside acquisition. Should supply adequate leverage to increase operations without compromising present reserves. I witnessed the magistrate's appearance transform as she processed it. A delicate contraction encompassing her sight perception, the expression of someone recalibrating everything she'd presumed regarding the person positioned through that table. Subsequently, William occupied the testimony seat. I hadn't thoroughly arranged myself for what it would demonstrate watching my spouse's biological father, positioned within that authorized location, providing documentation contrary to his offspring. His acoustic maintained steadiness, yet I could observe his fingertips trembling marginally where they positioned upon the wooden dividing barrier. He authenticated the succession, discovering the communications 18 months previously, the container positioned inside his storage facility, the envelope he'd offered me throughout that healthcare afternoon. Throughout Andrew's judicial representative requesting him, nearly incredulously, why a biological father would communicate contrary to his personal offspring, William regarded the magistrate straight and communicated without postponement. Because my offspring attempted constructing his potential upon my child's fiduciary reliance and my grandchild's biological parent's circumstantial vulnerability, he articulated, I committed my lifespan guaranteeing monetary documentation, communicated authentic information. I wasn't terminating that commitment, not currently, exclusively because the authentic information disappointed my individual familial circumstance. The judicial area experienced temporary quietness pursuing that declaration. Also, Andrew's representative appeared delaying prior to transferring forward. Throughout the tribunal's completion, nearly 180 moments afterward, the magistrate had observed adequate. She purchased an extensive inquiry regarding possible monetary fraudulent conduct, suspended all challenged accounts till the examination's finality, and confirmed the preliminary prohibition, preventing liquidation or restructuring of the waterside residence. Throughout the consecutive days, the fiscal organization Andrew utilized for the mortgage suspended his financial arrangement pending its personal interior examination of the reproduced signature, and his commercial borrowing designation, connected to comparable fabricated fiscal documentation, experienced discontinuation fully. Via Laura, I discovered that Andrew's renovation organization was currently experiencing difficulty beneath the heaviness of suspended properties and a discontinued borrowing designation. Obligations he depended upon throughout the approaching moments were disintegrating. The existence he'd manufactured upon loaned resources and loaned confidence was disintegrating at a momentum that appeared surprising even toward him. I experienced no sensations of achievement observing it happen. I genuinely necessitate communicating that genuinely. There didn't exist contentment in experiencing a person I'd experienced affection regarding throughout Ninit. In periods shed everything incrementally. Also a person who transmitted me falsity, reproduced my identification, and arranged approximately my mother's passing analogous to an spreadsheet computation. What I harbored alternatively was something quieter, the distinctive tiredness of ultimately being accepted, of experiencing a framework manufactured for safeguarding individuals resembling me actually execute its function. Carol contacted me double that period, her communicative sharp with a resentment that had nowhere additional to direct at this juncture, given that William had determined his positioning. She communicated allegations that I'd obliterated her familial existence, that I'd manipulated her spouse contrary to his offspring, that I'd demonstrated substantially greater interest in economic acquisition compared to 19 periods of matrimonial bonds. I entertained both moments without disrupting, and both moments I just conveyed identical material, previously terminating the communication. Andrew obliterated this familial unit, extended prior to I comprehended it existed, Carol. I merely discontinued performing as though I hadn't. Andrew, per his component, experienced quietness throughout a couple of moments, an uncharacteristic quiet that Laura cautioned me regarding distrusting. Individuals resembling this don't experience silence, subsequent to recognizing fail, she communicated via my telephone. They experience quietness subsequent to their reorganizing. She embodied accurately. Throughout the tertiary afternoon, my communication illuminated with his identification nearly at 11, and throughout my dismissing the connection, the communications persisted, progressively successive, progressively irate compared to previously. I repositioned my telephone to non-responsive configuration and positioned it upon my sleep furniture. Yet I lacked sufficient capability to attain slumber. Some persisting biological impulse remained experiencing his vehicle throughout my driveway. I lacked to pause extensively to comprehend if that impulse remained accurate. The striking initiated at 9:47 that Tuesday afternoon, and throughout my acknowledging the methodology of it, aggressive, misaligned, furious, I previously comprehended precisely the person positioned beyond my entrance. Communicate through the entrance. You've completely wrecked me. I positioned myself throughout my residential area, appendages encompassing me, posterior touching the frigid composition surface through the specific position where this description commenced. Andrew's communication fractured throughout that ultimate terminology, elevated and desperate, cleared of every increment of the conviction I'd acknowledged throughout 19 periods of matrimonial existence. I performed no motion direction my entrance. I didn't place my appendages toward the interface. Instead, I extracted my communication device and engaged documentation process, exactly how Laura had transmitted, if such circumstances transpired. Andrew, you necessitate abandoning, I articulated throughout the entrance, maintaining my acoustic positioned. You've liquidated my collective currency. My biological grandfather supported me. Do you recognize what you've executed toward my commercial structure? His closed phalanges impacted my entrance again, substantial this moment. What contributed my patriarch, he vocalized. What's positioned interior that box he maintains disguising? I observed what he declined inquiring. He declined questioning regarding my mother's contemporary recuperation condition. He declined questioning whether I existed securely positioned independently inside a construction he was contemporarily attempting to penetrate via his acoustic, not yet his physical appendages. 3 periods of deterioration and his singular inquiry concerned what documentation I maintained contrary to him. Go residence, Andrew, I articulated. The constables remain traveling at this present moment. I'd phoned them throughout my comprehending his automobile arriving into my driveway, something biological triggering previous conscious contemplation. It didn't characterize the emergency illuminations that ultimately discontinued him. It embodied illumination dispersal as an additional automobile positioned itself subsequent to his truck, and William graduated, progressing more rapidly compared to I'd observed him progress throughout months. Andrew, William's communication penetrated via that evening atmosphere, constant in methodology that triggered even Andrew to motionless mid-impact. Terminate. Andrew reversed, and throughout all this proceeded, I experienced father and offspring positioned facial toward facial with nothing continuing unsaid separating them. You've executed this, Andrew articulated, his acoustic trembling. You distributed her everything, your personal offspring. William didn't recoil. He navigated till he positioned himself separating Andrew and my entrance. An elderly person throughout a weather-resistant covering becoming progressively imposing. Negative, William articulated quiet and absolute. You obliterated yourself. I exclusively discontinued facilitating your concealment of it. The porch illumination apprehended the instant completely. Andrew's appearance disintegrating. Not from authentic regret, I hypothesize, yet with the particular resentment of someone experiencing his concluding justification disappear. He unsealed his communication to articulate something extra, yet the acoustic of a constabulary transport redirecting toward the avenue suspended him. Couple representatives approached, quiet and procedural, and communicated with Andrew to disengage from the property. He regarded my entrance solitary instance. William positioned dependably toward the front, and something inside him appeared to comprehend there persisted nothing continuing to compete toward here. He navigated toward his automobile. He exited. I unsealed my entrance, exclusively pursuing the headlights, disappeared throughout the avenue. William positioned upon my entrance reception, his shoulders reduced compared to I'd ever experienced them, and I embraced him demonstrating something astonishing toward us both. Appreciate you, I articulated, for everything you've sacrificed to execute appropriately. I ought to have executed it extended prior, he articulated throughout my shoulder. I'm appreciative I ultimately executed it at a moment it remains significant. The multitudinous periods preceding occurred progressively compared to the tertiary period that upended everything. The methodology recovery persistently transpires versus deterioration. The relationship concluded officially throughout early botanical period. Andrew obtained mandated liquidation concerning the waterside residence, and considerable component of the assets progressed toward recompense concerning the fabricated borrowing and the monetary resources he'd channeled from my collective accounts. His organization, currently diminished, didn't thoroughly recoup subsequent to the financial suspension and the reputational destruction that dispersed throughout Nashville's professional reconstruction community whenever discussion concerning the reproduced signature became widespread. Carol discontinued interaction completely. William submitted his individual petition regarding partnership dissolution a couple moments subsequent to the tribunal, concluding a connection that had invested multitudinous periods bending regarding Carol's regulation. He transmitted to me one moment throughout refreshment, positioned through my cooking surface, regarding my dining furniture, that experiencing me ultimately establish boundaries regarding myself, had communicated what it experienced resembling desire something superior to quiet perseverance. My mother recuperated comprehensively. Her cardiovascular professional dispensed authorization regarding standard exertion throughout initial botanical period, and throughout botanical period's botanical abundance materialized. She positioned herself beyond her residential construction's rear in practically continuous positioning within the composition, cultivating produce similar she'd accomplished every epoch regarding my youthful existence. I positioned myself besides her threshold a particular afternoon throughout botanical period, experiencing her function the composition, the solar radiation reflecting throughout her hair's achromatic hue. I contemplated everything the preceding 6 moments had extracted and everything it had re-established toward me. I contemplated inscriptions that weren't my own. I contemplated correspondence structuring arrangements surrounding her mortality. I contemplated a communication exchange that instructed me to arrange autonomously. And I contemplated an envelope and a construction space, and a biological grandfather who selected authenticity regarding allegiance toward his personal genetic material, and a sibling who never momentarily paused prior to donating everything she maintained. My mother examined upward, eliminating composition from her appendages, and smiled toward me through the methodology she maintained regarding my complete lifetime, maintained, unwavering, existing. I comprehended sentiment indicated surrendering anything. I transmitted to her, positioning myself beside her composition foundation. Currently, I comprehend sentiment represents the individuals who remain throughout existence's difficult moments. She positioned her appendages toward me and compressed, identical methodology she'd executed throughout that therapeutic facility numerous months beforehand, and we positioned jointly within the quietude, the variety of quietude that ultimately experienced similar residence instead of reduction. If you've continued regarding me via every component of his account, appreciate your commitment toward persisting. I remain contemplating that area occasionally. The iteration of myself who positioned themselves thinking 19 periods represented something it never genuinely embodied. And I wish, irrespective of your situation, this account reminded you that authenticity perpetually manifests finally, despite when it necessitates individuals you never anticipated requesting to transmit it forth. I genuinely appreciate comprehending the geographical situation you're encountering tonight, so communicate throughout my remarks. We exchange accounts resembling this basically regularly. Thus, in case this specific account continued regarding me, subscribe to avoid losing the subsequent. I'll observe you subsequently.